Hi, everyone, and welcome to the new Selling of Sales podcast. I'm your host, Marty Holmes. My guest today is Professor Deva Rangarajan. Deva is a professor of marketing at IESEG School of Management in Paris, France. His main areas of research include B2B industrial marketing, Salesforce and key account management, and digital transformation in sales organizations. Deva holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from India and a PhD in marketing from the University of Houston in the US. He has worked closely with more than 40 companies to consult and deliver customized executive programs. So welcome, Deva. Thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you, Marty. It's an absolute honor to be featured in this podcast of yours as well.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. We just want to give everyone an opportunity to learn how wonderful the world of professional sales is.
Absolutely.
And the variety and interesting people that make up the sales community.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I think today what we're going to do is spend a lot of time talking about research and specifically sales research. But before we do that, you have such an interesting story to share about your journey from engineering to sales. And I'd just love for you to share that with our listeners.
Yeah. And again, for the listeners out there, if you've dealt with academics, especially in the world of business in the United States and in business schools, you'll see there's a lot of Indian academics in the marketing, and many of them, at least my age, 40 plus, might have the same trajectory. That is, you did engineering because that was the way to actually get a job. And then after that, what you would do is that you would go to a job, you would work for some time, and then realize, wait a minute, engineering was something that was great. It initially put bread on the table, but what you were doing in the world of business might actually trigger something in you, some interest in you that you would then go on to go and pursue. And again, and that's pretty much what happened to me. I ended up in doing engineering, mostly because my dad was an engineer, and he said if he needed to pay my tuition, it had to be because I was doing engineering. So I didn't have too much of a choice. So essentially, that was it. The only choice I had was, did I have to do mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or electronic engineering, right? And even there, the nudge was more towards mechanical engineering because that's what he did. So essentially, that was something that I did. But again, in hindsight, right, things happen for a reason. So essentially, while I just did it, I just went with the flow. And then I ended up getting a job in a German multinational based out of India, the subsidiary, and I was into sales. And Marty, sales at that time was not the sales that we talk about right now. We were actually a monopoly in the Indian market. So my manager's idea of training was, here is a set of technical manuals for week 1. Week 2, you go out there and sell. And I said, but what if I make mistakes? And he said, well, guess what? We are a monopoly. The customer does not have a choice. So that was it. But I'm not saying that it was a he in this case. It's not that he did not have any intention. But the fact was that, like in most organizations where in those times, sales was pretty much where people went in. And if you're very product driven, if you work for very product driven organizations, you had to really be bad to mess up taking the order from the customer. So essentially, the job of sales was actually not to make mistakes and to make sure that all the good works that the good folks in the marketing and especially product marketing folks and engineering have done, you just go take orders and come back. And essentially that was it. And I couldn't blame him, but I loved that part. I loved the part about going out there, meeting individuals. And of course, when you're talking about technical products, that engineering background helped me enormously because even though I was talking about a lot of things, the discussion, Marty, was very interesting. And that's what's happening in a lot of companies too. As a salesperson, the discussion initially, you start talking about a little bit about that. But if you're well known, not you as an individual, but the company, and you're able to go past that, the discussion then turns to terms and conditions and negotiations and start saying, okay, where are we going to be creating value? And then you start going into that part of the sales process, which I absolutely loved. I didn't realize it, but I loved it to the point where a year and a half into that, I said, okay, maybe I wanted to study more. Ended up coming to the United States. But even then, at that point in time, the possibility of doing a PhD was not something that was crossing my mind. I was just thinking that if I have to go to the US, we did not have this idea that you could shift directly from having a bachelor's in engineering into marketing and sales. I didn't realize that you could do it in the US. So I come out there, start doing my master's in mechanical engineering, realized that I was really not cut out for mechanical engineering because of that. I had that 1.5 years of being out in the field and
that taste.
That taste was there. But then what happened was, and I think that was something in my case, talk about serendipity. And essentially, I was miserable, but I could not necessarily quit the program, because if I did that, I would be out of status according to the immigration reason. So I said, I'm going to try and just work it out and then see what's going to happen. But at that point in time, I got a chance to meet a person who was actually a doctoral student at the University of Houston in the business school. And he's currently now, his name is Dr. Raji Chambadi. He's now the president of Illinois Institute of Technology out there. But essentially, he was the one who said, hey, have you considered doing a PhD in business? I said, what? You could do a PhD in business? And he was exactly the same as I. Yeah, Marty, he had done a mechanical engineering degree. He had worked, and then he'd come essentially
the same path.
The same path, right? So essentially, you're seeing a fellow Indian, not just a fellow Indian. We are a country of at least 18 to 20 official languages. So we spoke the same language. We're from the same city.
Oh, wow.
Right? Apparently somewhere like we are 6, 7, like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So kind of stuff. We somehow apparently also are related there apparently. And he tells me that there's a possibility to do it. I ended up getting into the program. And a year after taking courses, I ran into, God, that was one of the best things that happened to me as well. A little known gentleman called Eli Jones. Now, for those of you who are in the world of sales,
love Eli Jones. Yes,
exactly. Eli Jones, the Eli Jones for me at least, Dr. Eli Jones, and who of course was there at the University of Houston. He just set up the sales center there, and this is one of the first premier institutions that was actually looking at sales. So I got into it. And essentially along the process, I fell in love with what I was doing. And then, of course, once I got my PhD, I just wanted to see life in a different part of the world. And life took me to different shores and different parts of the world.
How interesting. You met the right people at the right time.
Yes, absolutely. You talk about research and sales enablement, right? In sales enablement, they talk about, hey, providing the right information to the right salesperson at the right time. But the fact is that this was my career enablement, right? This was finding the right people at the right time. So this was all aligned perfectly.
Oh, that's such a wonderful story. Such a wonderful story. And interesting too, because it helps people to realize that, you may start down one path.
Absolutely.
But opportunity may allow you to change your course and find your true passion, something that you love.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
And that's what it is. Absolutely, Mandy. And I think sorry for interrupting. I just want to say this. For those people who actually have this negative connotation about what sales is, if you happen to be in a business school and if you're not in supply chain and you're not in finance, you want to do something in marketing, guess what? At some point of time or the other, you're going to end up in sales.
Right.
They might call it fancy terms like account executive or, business development executives, but it's just a glorified term for being in a position where you need to be influencing somebody within the customer's organization and bring home your point.
Yes. I think a lot of people don't realize that sales is about being an advisor, understanding your client, understanding their company, what they do your research. So I'm totally on board with everything you just said, Deva. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's talk about how you got involved in sales research.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Indeed. So essentially, the whole idea, as part of your PhD, and again, for the listeners here, if you're already in the PhD track, and what I'm going to say is it's going to be like, the saying, something that you've done as well, but for the others as well, as part of your PhD, you're supposed to choose a particular topic and then hone in on the topic, right? And Dr. Jones, Eli, at that time was working with a company, And essentially, this company was actually rolling out a CRM technology. At that time, it was not necessarily called CRM. It was part of CRM called SFA, Salesforce Automation, right? How do you automate certain processes that your salespeople are going through? And Eli, Dr. Jones, was actually saying, you know what, this could be a topic that you might want to try and take a look at, and how should firms try to go about implementing these technologies, with the main idea of trying to get the productivity of the sales force up. And that was the initial idea. But what you very quickly understand is that once you get in and you start talking to some of the salespeople to understand, okay, what kind of models we want to try and test, it became very obvious that it was not as straightforward as we think it is. The top management thinks that this is going to be an easy rollout of technology without necessarily paying attention to the nuances about how is this technology going to disrupt the way that salespeople are used to working. What would it require of salespeople to actually make sacrifices to? So, for example, you'd have a long day, and we were living in Houston, so essentially you could easily imagine some of the reps would have to travel for hours, sometimes going from client to client. Then you come back, and then you have to actually fill in your visit report in your Salesforce system. So not the easiest thing to do. So this was something that got me started as part of my PhD, and that's how was technology influencing them as well. And so that's how the whole idea of doing research started. And one of the nice things about sales research, and I'm sure that everybody who has been in this domain of sales research, is that while there is theory behind it, but we are studying real world phenomenon happening. It could be that by the time we do the research and get it published, things have moved on, because that's the academic rigor of what we do.
Right.
But we are looking at real world problems that companies face. When we talk to salespeople, when we take a look at measuring them, when we ask them to do surveys, when we take a look at their actual performance data, try to connect things together, that's essentially what is happening. So that's how it started, this idea of research. But it was, again, with something that was relevant to the sales force at that time. Right? And this was, I'm talking about 2002, 2003. And then, of course, my career took me to Belgium, where I was really privileged. I went from a school that trained me to actually do research to a business school where we mostly worked with executives, right? Research was something that was a lot more applied. So essentially, you're not talking about a 28-year-old. At that time, I was 28 when I got out of my PhD program. And I go in to a business school in Belgium called Vlerick, where the initial idea was to stay there for 3 years, end up with 14 years. But then I go in there, and essentially I realized that they did not have an undergraduate program. They only had programs that did not work with the semester system. And they mostly catered to audiences who are executives. So essentially, what happened was I went from training undergraduate students who were actually a lot more receptive to the way you would teach to highly demanding executives. And essentially what happens is that very quickly you realize that the way you do and talk to them is going to be quite different. But the flip side of it is, when you work with these executives, you have this rich source of information about what is happening in the real world out there. What are the real problems that salespeople and sales managers face? So what happened, I went completely from very, what can I say, numbers driven in terms of where I was trained in the United States, into much more qualitative, trying to understand, doing interviews and seeing what are things that emerge. And this is what happened in terms of research. And most of them were what was happening to business at that point in time, at different points in time. And so it was becoming very, very relevant in terms of what we were doing. And of course, if you have kept track of what's happened, of course, we had with 2015 and 16, we slowly started having this digital transformation, catching up very quickly. So it's almost like full circle. I started out with CRM, and now it's almost like I'm now working on how technology has become a lot more accessible, a lot more friendly, a lot cheaper, and almost every company right now is going through this, right? Isn't that what they call data is the new oil?
Right.
So from that perspective, and so now my research continues on from where it started. And now again, I'm coming back into how are these technologies shaping the sales function as we know today? It's a long-winded answer, but hopefully you kind of understand that.
Oh, no, I totally understand. And what's interesting about it is that you got to see both sides.
Yeah.
First, you started with your undergrads, and
Yeah.
and then you worked with executives, and so you went from trying to help the undergrads understand business
Yeah.
problems to actually being a part of people who were dealing with business problems.
Absolutely. And what was even nicer for me, and that's where I think I was just lucky, as is anybody who's had a chance to live and teach sales in different continents, right? Because you come in and let's say, for example, you're teaching in the United States. United States is still one huge market.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Again, there are nuances, right? There are nuances, but still it's one legal system, one judiciary, right? Of course, different states might have different laws and stuff like that, but for the most part, that's how it works. You're also going to have a highly mobile workforce that might be interested in moving and everything else. Of course, things are changing now, but then you go in and you start talking and you think that, wait a minute, I was in a small country called Belgium, population of 10 million. In a population of 10 million, 6 million spoke a language called Flemish, which is a dialect of Dutch. And 4 million spoke a version of French as well, right? Or with a dialect as well. So, and then you would have a sales force, Marty, I'm not kidding, for a country of 10 million, you might have a sales force that is divided based on language. You would have a sales force to deal with the Flemish speaking part. You would have one to deal with French. Again, depending upon the kind of business that you're in and if you needed that as well.
Right.
Then you would imagine that you go to Holland, which is the country next. You could imagine that in instances, you could actually have the same salesperson who speaks Flemish, which is a dialect of Dutch, to be able to get it. Yes, they can, but the differences in the way they do business and how clients make decisions are so different. Not to mention legal systems, legal rules, and everything else. And suddenly you realize Europe is not a single entity.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's great because you see a company, then you start talking to multinationals, which have one particular way of working in the United States and North America, for example. And they had to completely change their go-to-market structures, the way they looked at handling people, the way they went about the kind of different Salesforce incentive systems, motivation systems, which are going to be different. You're working for the same company, but you will have to much more look at adapting accordingly. And that is something that I had a chance to work with. And I still had my co-authors who are sitting in the US. So essentially what I'm looking at right now is I get both sides and I'm living this part where I'm talking to these executives who are telling me what's happening. And then I'm also doing that. And then, of course, my life brought me back to Ball State for 4 years in the United States. And then again,
I remember that time. Yes.
Absolutely. And that was again wonderful times where I wanted to come back and do more research because it got to a point where I was doing significant amounts of teaching and not had time to do research. But I ended up coming to the Ball State and I was doing great. But guess what? I was still relying on my contacts to do interviews. But this time I could do interviews because of technology, of course, with people across the pond. And we were able to compare challenges facing sales organizations in Europe and challenges of facing organizations in the United States. And then you can start comparing what's happening.
Oh, we seem to have lost Deva here. Let's see if we can get
work in different continents.
Are you?
Can you hear me? I'm here.
Okay. Yeah. Terrific. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I may have missed your last point.
Yeah, so what I was saying was that I've just been privileged to have had a chance to work in 2-3 different continents and also work with amazing people, amazing professionals that actually help me put things in perspective about what's happening in the world of business to business sales. That's
very, very interesting. And you were definitely in a unique position, a unique spot.
Yeah.
So what do you think? You talked about CRM and that emerging technology, which of course now is being used by virtually everyone. What do you think some of the topics are going to be for in the future?
So how long have we got, Marty? Do we have the whole afternoon right now? I'll just
Well, maybe we'll just narrow it
Yeah.
down to a couple.
2 or 3. Let me, you're right. I think a couple of things. When COVID struck, right, and essentially, I'm not saying that things were not already happening before. Things were already moving, and I think if you wanted to really go back, I'm sure that most of you have heard the Challenger sale, right? That was something
Oh,
that
yes.
came about.
Mhm.
And this is my belief that you had to have the stock market crash and the Lehman Brothers crash of 2007 and 8, which made many organizations realize that, hey, if I need to get past this, if I need to be profitable, there are 2 ways of doing it, right? One, I get my top line growth. That is, I get my salespeople to go out there and sell.
Mhm.
The other is I keep my costs under control,
Mhm.
right? So essentially what you suddenly saw was that customers were rethinking their idea about how to go about dealing with salespeople. How do they take control back? That
Mhm.
they do not always have to rely on salespeople for all that information, because salespeople have an agenda, right? Let's forget the fact that we talk about how salespeople have to be ethical and have to help the customers. That's not always how it's perceived by the customer, right?
Right.
So you suddenly saw power shifting more and more, or power being at least trying to be wrested away from sales into what procurement was doing. And along at the same time, you had these technologies like marketing automation slowly starting to make their way in. So the clients, and if you remember the statement that was 57% of a buying decision is made before
Mhm.
a customer, a B2B customer reaches out to a salesperson, kind of set the stage for how customers were no longer relying on the salesperson
Right.
for everything. And then they could actually rely on tech. They could go to the website, they could get that information, right? Now, if that was with the technology that we had 10 years ago, imagine how much strides we have made in terms of technology right
Oh,
now.
absolutely.
So, which means that the customer today has had more chance to quickly catch up. Now, COVID, so things are already happening, and in comes COVID, and suddenly what happens is even those skeptical customers who said I had to rely on the salesperson to come and help me,
Mhm.
now suddenly they said, hey, I'm stuck. Either my salesperson has been forbidden by their organization to actually come and visit us, or my company says we have policies about nobody visiting you and you're going to be working from home.
Right.
And for the first time, Marty, what we're seeing is salespeople who normally could get away without using any of the technologies that their companies were asking them to use,
Right.
now had to maybe slowly start accepting it because their clients were forcing them to do it.
Yes.
Because your clients are saying, now we want you to do this. We don't want you to come and visit us face to face. We want you to. And some of these companies are now saying, wait a minute, I was buying the same thing before, but why did I waste so much time? And every time the salesperson comes, I have to stop everything and do that, right? So now what's happening, and this is triggering a lot of things as well. So not every customer is going to be like that. Some customers are going to be much more digitally savvy. Other customers are not. But guess what? The salesperson has to adapt according to whatever kind of customer and what is the preference of the customer, right? So which means the customer can choose to be a digital primitive, right? So essentially, they could be still working like in the Stone Ages, and you could have another customer who's like light years ahead. But as a salesperson, I have to deal with both. So the capabilities of salespeople has kind of evolved, and this was actually captured by McKinsey, who said that not just sales organizations, but salespeople have to become much more comfortable with omni-channel presence. So essentially, what's going to happen is a sales organization must be more prepared to have a very flexible way of approaching its customers. You would hear things like customer journeys and everything else. But now your salespeople also who represent you have to become a lot more digitally savvy and omni-channels. That's one of the main things that's happening right now. Is you're going to have organizations are going to become omni-channel, and which automatically means that your salespeople now have to become more and more omni-channel. Omni-channel being that whichever channel the customer chooses to interact with you, the salespeople should be in a position to provide a seamless experience. What this means then is salesperson is not an individual himself or herself anymore. or themselves anymore. They need the support of people within their own organization. So what you will see is sales organizations now have, first of all, new roles, right? So you will have new roles like inside sales. You would call them SDRs, sales development reps, BDRs, business
Right.
development reps, AEs,
Acronyms. Yes.
acronyms, right? Now, what's going to happen is these people, what would they do? Well, guess what? In the past, when I was in sales, even though we were a monopoly, I would get yellow pages. I would pick up the phone and call my client. Now, the client is not waiting for me to pick up the phone and call. The client is actually engaging with me, going to my website, or my marketing team is actually sending them messages or conducting webinars. You know what I mean?
Right.
And putting
Right.
forth things on my website. And so leads are coming in, which salespeople are so inundated with it that you need this inside sales to actually kind of screen the calls first, kind of qualify them and pass it on. I'm simplifying a lot of things, but just to give you an idea. So suddenly you have marketing creating leads that salespeople were doing in the past. So
Right.
now the sales organization suddenly needs to have lead generation, which is their job, being done by marketing folks. So what you see then is you see this transition to marketing and roles like marketing operations, markups.
Yes.
Coming up, right? Markups coming up. Now what's going to happen is then you're going to have markups, then you're going to have salespeople using it. And then but of course, if I'm looking at an inside salesperson, if they have to deal with 500 calls or 500 clients over the course of a week, they need technology to help them manage all this.
Right.
So if Marty has to call, let's say 20 to 25 prospects a day to kind of qualify them and then pass it on to the field sales force, Martini. So then you have these kind of new sales engagement like outreach, sales loft. These are things and terms I'm sure companies that you've heard as well. And they would then work with the LinkedIn navigators of the world, the Zoom info, to try and get information about who they're talking to, right? So now you have marketing operations, you have the tech coming in there. And then on top of that, now you need to have to make sure that the salespeople who are doing their job, how do they manage their time? Are they being successful? Suddenly you have sales ops. That is a set of people who are taking data away from all your different screens and stuff, and then making them into manageable reports that the sales manager can then work with. So essentially you have a salesperson, right, who interacts with the sales manager, but the salesperson gets the help of inside sales marketing to generate leads and the tech folks. The sales manager, sometimes if they're lucky, they're going to get sales ops, sales operations folks who are actually going to pull out the data about how my salespeople are performing. So you're getting all these new roles coming in that we did not have before. Now, managing this becomes the whole thing. So now you can see the omni-channel marketing means new roles, new capabilities, new functions. Automatically then, how do I target my clients? New roles coming up, and those are the kind of things that you see happening. Of course, in each one of them, there are different challenges, but this, in my opinion, is where we are heading more and more with marketing and sales, increasingly working on this. And the last thing is your customer has become more demanding than ever.
And more knowledgeable.
Absolutely, right? Because along with knowledge comes the demands, right? Essentially, what's going to happen is they're going to say, in the past, Marty, what was it? You would go to a salesperson would sell you something, and they're actually selling you a promise of what could possibly work. It's like in a marriage, right? So you marry somebody after 2-3 years of dating, and this is a promise that these people will not change for the rest of their life, but it's not true. Then reality hits. You have all that kind of stuff. So similarly, think of it from the viewpoint of the salesperson makes a promise to a customer, and that promise is made on a lot of assumptions. One, the salesperson's organization can deliver on what the salesperson is promising.
Yes.
The customer is buying something, but it could not be the customer who's going to end up using it. They could have people within their own organization who also need to toe the line and do what is expected of them. There are so many things.
Yeah.
And right now, the client is saying, you know what? It's not my headache. You came and got the sale from me. Prove that you are delivering value. If not, I'm going to take my business elsewhere. Right. So for the moment, and that is particularly true with the new kinds of companies, like, if you look at the Netflixes of the world, and Netflix is like, if you don't like what you see, you don't like a particular program, you say, I'm going to cancel it, right? That's it.
Right.
It's not that you bought a DVD player or VHS players, remember VHS players? So it's
Oh,
not
yes.
that, it's not that we have that one day to the other. You can just say, imagine the same thing. You get a subscription of Salesforce, you don't like it, that's it. I'm going to try. You know what I mean? So essentially, the customer now is asking, and which means then that salespeople have to be very careful about what they promise.
Yes.
You need to handhold the customer. So you have new roles like customer success also come
Oh,
in
yes.
as well. So
Customer
these are the
success
kind of
manager.
things in it, right? But these are all part of the whole commercial organization. So these are some of the things. And as a researcher, you can pick parts of these.
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially, I have projects going on about what is the role of marketing operations. I have a project going on about what is the role of customer success, right? We are looking into how can salespeople use social media to influence customers. So
Mm-hmm.
these are then some of the projects that we work on by picking up on all the mega trends that's happening as well. Did that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Our listeners could pick out so many different points
Yeah,
from what you just said
yeah,
and centralize on one. It would make a great research topic.
absolutely.
Great research topic. Yeah. It's fascinating. I picked up on a lot of things you said, and I'm thinking, the terms that we're hearing a lot here in the US is that
Yeah.
the salesperson has to be agile, which is
Yes,
what you're saying about knowing the different pieces and parts of the client's operation, the customer. They have to be adaptable, and
yes,
the new roles and the new functions are coming out
absolutely,
very quickly, very quickly. But
absolutely.
yeah, one thing that here at SEF that we're so happy to see
Yeah.
is an elevation of the concept of sales and marketing working together.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that when I was talking about how marketing is generating leads and stuff like that,
Mhm.
that is essentially what it is. And that is what is happening. And you mentioned SEF, right? I think SEF together with the USCA,
Mhm.
the University Sales Center Alliance together are doing a wonderful job of at least trying to try to bring like-minded universities together to
Right.
share best practices. I know that the SEF also supports research grants, thanks to Neil
Yes.
Rackham as well.
Yes.
That is again something that you're doing as well, and that's all is absolutely necessary, because sales as a discipline, unfortunately, unlike marketing, is so misunderstood. It still is misunderstood.
Mhm.
It's
Absolutely.
still as, and essentially, it has to be thought of as a science. It's not an art. And Dr. Jones has always kind of drilled that in me, is that, hey, it is more of a science. And to
Mhm.
be honest, with my engineering background, it absolutely, tell me it's a science, it's there's a process to it, I can
Mhm.
buy into it. And that's
Right.
because I'm an engineer first, right? Even
Mhm.
though I don't do it now. And that's what it is. And essentially, you need to structure this in the way we go about shaping young minds. And that's something that you will see the curriculum also change. If
Mhm. It
you'll
is
notice
changing.
that I at Ball State, I taught a class called Sales Technology, right? I know that people like Rob Peterson over at
Mhm.
NIU, Northern Illinois, Howard Dower over at UT Dallas,
Yes.
Joel LeBon and John Hopkins.
Mhm.
These are all people who are in the vanguard, right? They're pushing the boundaries in terms of getting the
They
salespeople,
are.
the students that they have towards that.
Mhm. And
And I was
they're pushing other professors towards it too.
absolutely right. Absolutely, you need to do
Absolutely.
that as well, right?
Mhm.
And I was teaching a class on sales technologies, where I would break down the sales process, and I would say, here are the different technologies that are involved in the different steps of the sales process. And essentially, what you see is that a lot of it has got to do with the kind of content. Now, where does the content get used
Mhm.
in different steps of the sales process? Who's responsible for that? Then you have marketing that has to work together with sales. So you see
Right.
that. And now it's going to be marketing to work with sales, with customer success, with service. So you
Mhm.
see that there was this quote, and I think you also picked up on it. I was actually in a conference last week, and I think it was apparently by Kotler. And it's very ironic that a marketing professor, not ironic, it's apt that a marketing professor actually says that a whole company, a sales department is not the whole company, but the whole company better be a sales department.
Ah, yes. Yes. I love
I
that
think it's
quote.
very
I
it's
love it.
very aptly put, right? So essentially, it's just not about marketing and that. You could have marketing and sales work together, but if the rest of your supply chain messes up, all the good work is gone, because essentially you cannot go what you go to a client to have a meaningful conversation, and the client starts yelling at you saying that, hey, you said you're going to deliver on time. Where is the delivery?
Right.
So
Right.
essentially, it's a whole organization that is responsible for sales and continuing sustainable sales as well.
And success. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, this has really been fascinating. I've so enjoyed talking with you. I had a lot of other questions, which leads me to believe maybe what we ought to do is schedule another podcast in the
Sure. Good thing.
future so we can pick up on the other 50% of the questions that I had.
Yes, absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
it's been absolutely wonderful, Deva.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your interesting stories
Yeah.
and your thoughts and suggestions
Yeah.
for research topics for young doctoral students out there or current educators who are looking for topics. And I feel like I would be amiss if I didn't mention that, because you mentioned the research grants, again, started by Neil Rackham, wonderful friend of SEF for a number of years. We are currently in the process of collecting submissions
Fantastic.
for 2022.
Yeah.
There's actually 4 weeks left in this year's open call.
Wow.
There's information on our website, on our LinkedIn page. So I encourage anybody, if you're out there thinking about research and you're looking for some funding, you've got 4 weeks to put it all together and send it in. And yeah. So we're excited about that too. Okay, Deva, as I said, thank you so much. I think there's going to be more conversations between you and I to come.
Absolutely. It's an absolute pleasure, Marty. And again, please continue the great work that you're doing out there at SEF.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the support that you give to researchers with Neil Rackham and Stevenses and stuff like that as well. And I look forward to, again, more of your podcasts and more of your posts on SEF as well.
Thank you. We're all about sharing information and letting people know that universities and professors like yourself are out there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. I'm going to sign off now. So take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.